Hi, my name is Deb Liu, and I am the president and CEO of Ancestry. As a proud Chinese American and descendant of Chinese immigrants, I am honored to welcome all of you today to the panel discussion on the Chinese exclusion era. A few weeks ago, Ancestry launched our collection of Chinese exclusion era records and made it available to everyone at no cost. These records serve as a reminder of the prejudice faced by Chinese people living in and immigrating to the United States and Canada during this time. It is through preservation and conversations like the panel today that we can increase awareness and understanding of this complex time in our shared history. On behalf of the Chinese American Museum and Ancestry, I want to thank you for joining us today. And now I'll hand it over to David to begin today's program.
Well, welcome. I'm David Uwe, Executive Director of the Chinese American Museum in Washington, D.C. We are the first and only museum in our nation's capital dedicated to the Chinese American story. Today's discussion is Chinese exclusion in the U.S. and Canada. This event is made possible through the generous support of Ancestry, who obviously just had that very exciting announcement. Even if you're somewhat familiar with Chinese exclusion in the US, you may be surprised by the uncanny parallels between the legal and social forces that led to discrimination of Chinese in both countries. I am honored to be joined by three definitive experts on this topic. Mei Nai is the Lung Family Professor of Asian American Studies and Professor of History and co-director of the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race at Columbia University. She is a US legal and political historian interested in questions of immigration, citizenship, and nationalism. She's an award-winning author of Impossible Subjects, Illegal Aliens and the Making of Modern America, The Lucky Ones, One Family and the Extraordinary Invention of Chinese America, and The Chinese Question. Before becoming a historian, she was a labor union organizer and educator in New York City. She is now working as co-editor of Corky Lee's Asian America, 50 Years of Photographic Justice, which I will add is also a new exhibit on Corky Lee at our museum. And she's also working on a new book, Nation of Immigrants, a short history of an idea. Linda Yip is an author, researcher, storyteller, and speaker who has been invited to businesses and nonprofits, colleges, and historical societies in Canada and the United States. She's been featured in a variety of projects, including film, print, radio, and television. She's an entrepreneur and a professional genealogist and expert in Chinese Canadian genealogy. She uses her organizational skills to manage a private archive of over 60,000 documents and images. She is a member of the Ancestry Advisory Board of Canadian Genealogists and the Association of Professional Genealogists. Her groundbreaking level 1 study of Canada's first documented Chinese family has been approved by the prestigious International Commission for the Accreditation for Professional Genealogists. Her blog, pastpresence.com, has become a trusted resource with a readership of over 250,000 people in 182 countries. She is the author of Getting Started in Chinese Genealogy, a family historian's guide, even if you don't speak or read Chinese. And last but not least is our friend Ted Gong, who is who's retired from the U.S. Foreign Service in 2009 as a senior Foreign Service officer. There he worked on policies, laws, and operations related to visas, border security, immigration, refugees, citizenship, and consular services. He served in U.S. embassies and consulates in Guangzhou, Hong Kong, Taipei, Manila, and Sydney, and at the Department of State and Homeland Security. This is the role I know him as the founder director of the 1882 Project Foundation, and he is president of the DC chapter of the Chinese American Citizens Alliance. Ted was educated at the University of California and the U.S. Army War College in National Strategic Studies, and he received a Frederick Douglass Award, the FD 200 Award in 2019. So 3 people that are very qualified for the conversation for this evening. So our audience probably has varying degrees of familiarity with Chinese exclusion. May, can you just start us off with some background on what it is and how it came to be?
Sure. First, I want to apologize. My screen went wonky, so I've been trying to fix it.
Technology.
So thank you, David, and the Chinese American Museum, and thank you to Ancestry for organizing this event and for having me on. It's my pleasure to be here. So just some quick facts. The Chinese exclusion laws in the United States ran from 1875 to 1943. The first was the Page Act of 1875, which excluded Chinese contract laborers and prostitutes, and then a general exclusion beginning in 1882, which was repealed in 1943. Now, exclusion forbid the immigration of all Chinese to the United States, with a few exceptions like merchants and clergy. And it excluded all Chinese, regardless of occupation, from naturalized citizenship. So this is where we get the idea that Chinese are forever foreign to the United States. Exclusion extended to all Asians by the 1920s and was not entirely repealed until 1952. Now, what did exclusion mean? It meant, for those Chinese in the United States, it meant extreme marginalization in the labor market. It meant that Chinese and other Asians cannot go to school with whites, cannot testify in court against whites, cannot marry white people, cannot own agricultural property, cannot be licensed in professions like teaching and commercial fishing. Not least, exclusion meant the separation of families. A new book that's just out, a memoir by Fei Mayan Ng called Orphan Bachelors, sums this up really in a devastating way. Exclusion was a brilliant crime because it was bloodless. It meant generations of the unborn. Now, I just want to make a quick comment, and we can maybe come back to this later, but why? Why was the United States so against including Chinese in our society? I think that, there's been a lot of discussion and writing about the racism against the Chinese, but I want to offer, in addition, a broader context, which is that of the American Civil War and its aftermath. The Civil War resulted in freedom for the former slaves, but in the 1870s and 80s, there was a white backlash in the South with the KKK, Jim Crow, et cetera, et cetera. The United States reneged on the promise of equality for the formerly enslaved people. Chinese exclusion was part of the same moment when the United States turned away from the Civil War's promise of equality. In the late 19th century, the West, like the South, was integrated into a unified nation, but not based on democracy, but rather based on white supremacy. The big lie that justified Chinese exclusion was that Chinese were coolies or indentured workers or slaves or just like slaves. Therefore, they were unassimilable because they were allegedly a slave race. Anti-coolieism was a racial shorthand that compared Chinese immigration to slavery. And it was on that basis that Congress and the American body politic made sure that Chinese would not be included. So I'm going to stop there, maybe pass it on to Linda, who can talk about the Canadian situation.
Thank you, May. Thank you to the Chinese American Museum in DC for inviting me to this panel, and thank you to Ancestry for sponsoring it. I do have some preparatory remarks. And I'd like to bring this to what exclusion means to me. I'd like to share this story. You know, when I introduced my husband to my family, I was sure to mention his profession, engineer. You know, the old joke in our community, right? You can be anything you want to be, provided it's a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. Instant approval. I think this joke has its roots in exclusion, that the 6 decades left us with a legacy of needing to prove our worth to others and ultimately to ourselves. And it's had incredible side benefits for Canada and the United States. Our community's contributions to all the fields, from cultural to professional, is incalculable. Never mind the outstanding contributions to our tax base. Am I right? And yet, institutionalized exclusion also meant that people who look like us were always having their loyalties questioned. Where were we really from? Were we good citizens or not? 60 years is about 2 generations. That's a long time for a community, and they couldn't explain why, only what was. I've spent 30 years of my life trying to understand why. Too often, we are those cliched model citizens who work ceaseless hours for no recognition, hoping that somebody will notice. But economics are no replacement for our roots, and work by itself doesn't address the stigma. I'm a genealogist. Genealogy is about the records. Records prove we existed and give the details. They allow us to break the silence and know our history from our point of view, from the academic to the personal. We don't need to wait for others to recognize us. We can find our own stories. What I have found is such a story of endurance and survival, family roots and family pride. That's what I want everyone listening here today to take away, our pride. For example, when I was at the opening of the new Chinese-Canadian Museum in Vancouver, Canada, on July 1st, a man came up to me with tears in his eyes. He was at the paper trail to the 1923 Exclusion Act exhibition with his family, including his grandfather. Seeing the documents, his grandfather said, "Oh yes, I remember these." And he proceeded to tell his truth to his family for the first time. This is why I do what I do. So in Canada, the government appeared to model its Chinese Exclusion Act on America's, except 3 years later and with harsher laws. Instead of a quota system, practically no Chinese were admitted 1923 through 1947. That's 24 years and less than 50 people. In addition to cutting Chinese men off from their wives and family in China, the act also required all Chinese, regardless of place of birth, to register with the Department of Immigration and Colonization. Some 58,000 people registered or else faced $500 fines and a year in jail. These records are a part of the freely available collection at Ancestry as part of their philanthropic endeavor. Finally, I'd like to note that the Canadian Exclusion Acts were a foundational set of legislation, 1885 through 1947, that they provided a base of exclusion for hundreds of other laws to be enacted or continued against our community, from businesses and employment, hiring practices and hours, professional designations, head taxes, voting, and a lot more. So as Catherine Clement, the curator of the Paper Trail exhibition, says, an unintended benefit of exclusion for us is the resulting abundance of records.
So, Ted, maybe you could draw some parallels between what you've seen with the Canadian laws and the US laws. You know, like 1947 seems to match up with 1943, the Magnuson Act. And Linda, maybe this is a question back to you. What was it that drove the year 1947 to overturn it on paper? Was it something similar to our 1943, which was just, you know, we wanted China as an ally in World War II? Was that part of the thinking at the time?
Ted, I'll let you jump in first.
I think there's that's a question I like to hear many of us answer. What is the difference between the Canadian attitude toward the Chinese immigration or non-immigration and the American? I think that when I was processing visas, I used to really contrast the immigration laws of Canada had and then the way the U.S. had it, and there are very stark differences. And I used to admire the Canadian prescription how to bring in people into the United States. The one thing that stands out in America, and I think that maybe you're looking, is the one of the earlier attitudes in the 1880s and so forth. It's is the just plain racism. America just didn't want a colored society. That, despite what we know about what America ideals are, the way that it operated was to try to keep colored people out, and Chinese was something that they could identify very quickly and use it for other for many reasons. And if you look at the legislative history, a lot of it is for the purpose of actually the Southerners trying to recreate their position after the Civil War, and then that sort of attitude and moving out to the West. I think there's a reason why I think and May will probably correct me quickly. There's a reason why the violence against the Chinese in the American history was largely a West Pacific Northwest type of thing. Partially the Chinese were there too, but that I think a lot of the racism just moved over to California and things of this sort because they had just lost the Civil War and they were moving in that place and trying to take over that sort of thing. It's a very, I don't know what triggered the 47 change, but I'm sure it also has something to do with what triggered the 43 change. And that is that the international setting was quite different, and the China and US are supposed to be allies during World War II. We could talk about later about why it is so important today to emphasize the fact that the Chinese Americans or the Chinese Canadians contributed to the protection of Canada, the United States during the wars or during other crises and so forth. And I think that is very important to point out. But one thing that we tried to do in 1882 Foundation is look at the entire history and say that regardless of what being in, whether it is 1875 or any of the other acts, the thing about the Chinese and Americans is they were as much as any of the other nationalities that built this nation, and that what drives us in the 1882 Foundation is not so much to point out all the harm and the crime and things of this that were done against the Chinese, but point out that we deserve to be in this place because we helped build it. Like this, and what we're doing is we have lost people's people deliberately erasing our history, or us not really telling the history correctly. And that is the role of what 1882 Foundation, the Ancestry, and other people will look into these records. It's for the purpose of making sure that history is known so that people know that we built and participated in this nation and therefore deserve to be part of it.
And it almost seems like Dennis Kearney and the Working Man Party and the rise in anti-Chinese sentiment, it really just came after that great victory of completing the Transcontinental Railroad, and it almost seems like it really was part of just a political playbook that was fabricated at that point, because it should have been a real triumphant victory for these Chinese laborers at that time, but it was a real concerted effort to erase that. I don't know.
You asked, David, about 1947 and the timing, and my research suggests that, well, first of all, why was it repealed in 1947, which is 2 years after World War II? And it was a coalition. Canada had also signed on to the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And so there is perhaps some international embarrassment happening across the border. In addition, a committee was struck the committee to repeal the Chinese Exclusion Act. They worked for about 2 years and formed a coalition of, labor groups, church groups, and that sort of thing. They involved the press and media. The act was repealed in 1947. However, as May mentioned, that the Exclusion Act in the States lingered on until 1952. Similarly, in Canada, the Exclusion Act lingered on until, at least the 1950s, where I noticed that two very obscure laws replaced the Exclusion Act. And so immigration was still curtailed. Chinese persons still had great difficulty getting their families across. X-rays were employed, and that was a system that had been tried and abandoned by the States 10 years previous, but Canada was still carrying on.
Well, to give people some context, 1943, 1947, the U.S. and Canada, respectively, even though these laws are overturned on paper, they in the U.S., what is it, 105 Chinese allowed per year, and then less than that in Canada, right? About 100.
About under 50 for 24 years.
But I think one of the great differences in the way that, and I like to explore that attitude a little bit more, is that the Canadian exclusions and so forth were based upon, may have had some racial things in the background, but in the front in the United States, it is race. You're excluded because you are racially different. And the idea is that a Chinese race and its and their background just cannot become, they are just anathema to democracy, and so therefore they should be not allowed to come into the United States, something of this sort. But I think that might be an interesting thought to think about a little bit further, to explore how much was it just pure racism, that sort of thing. I think that has a very, people are trying to get into the United States or going through Canada because they thought it was a safer route to get in, right, to come in, even through Mexico, or coming in through Mexico. But the exclusion in the United States was race, is racially based.
May, you're muted.
It's racially based in Canada also, but it has a different idiom, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And I think one thing that I've researched is Chinese exclusion in the United States and comparing it to the British settler colonies. Yeah. Now, I studied South Africa and Australia, but Canada has many of the same similarities. So Canada's a dominion, right? It's part of the British Empire. The status of dominionhood was something that the Australians and Canadians first pursued in order to have maximum autonomy from London while still being under the protection of the crown. Now, why is this important? Because in the British have pretensions of equality. Mm-hmm. Now, the British Empire is built on violence and theft and dispossession, but British law has the conceit of being based on equality. So in the British colonies, when there were racist movements, just like in the United States, to exclude Asians, the colonial office and the foreign office didn't want them to have categorical exclusion because they also had imperial interests, commercial interests with China. They had a lot of balls in the air, so to speak. And the racist movements in Australia and South Africa and Canada had to compete for attention from London. So they had other kinds of laws, literacy tests, head taxes, and ultimately they had exclusion. I mean, Australia had to form a federation in 1901, at which time they declared themselves to be white Australia. This is explicit. They said, we have a white Australia policy. So I think if we look at Canada in that respect, is why you don't have the same kind of outright explicit racism, but you have it nonetheless. And it's something that Canada, just like Australia, has to bargain with the metropolitan center over the terms of that. I think also that Canada, because it's so proximate to the United States, has a lot more direct influence from American politics. So, but I think if we think about 1947, to me, this is the beginning or the kind of opening years of decolonization in the British Empire. And so India becomes independent. The settler colonies or the dominions have to face a similar kind of geopolitics that the United States faced in 1943. But it comes a little later, this geopolitical interest, because it comes in the context of decolonization within the British Empire. But still, like Linda points out, and like you point out, Ted, these are political reasons. These are strategic reasons. They don't have to do with wanting Chinese to come into your country. That's why they set the quotas so low.
Right.
I think when we're talking about the roots of racism, in Canada, our first prime minister was very clear when he said that Chinese were unassimilable and that we needed to think very carefully about the fabric of the country that we were building. There are lesser known laws which were very clear in wanting a white Canada. And, there is a reason why British Columbia is called British Columbia. Canada, I think we tend to gloss over our racism. We're more polite about it. We're more indirect with it. But I can see the racism right from the gold rush in the 1858s in British Columbia, where Chinese miners were assessed punitive taxes for mining licenses and for setting up businesses. So right from the get-go, there was anti-Chinese laws. But then later, the newspapers of the day, which you can read the headlines, and they're quite clear. White Canada, it was stated in 1901.
Even the miners' tax draws a parallel to the U.S. It's similar, yeah. What so as these laws unfolded, starting with the Page Act on, did they ever go up the court system? Did they ever make it to the Supreme Court? Where was it ever presented to be presented or examined as the constitutionality of it?
Well, yes, and this is one of the most important things with legacies of Chinese exclusion was that there are a number of Supreme Court cases. The Chinese were very active litigants. They were very active civil rights cases that they brought through the Chinese Six Companies and the Chinese consul in San Francisco. They were test cases, just like the NAACP brought test cases like Plessy or Brown. The Chinese brought their test cases and they challenged exclusion. They challenged deportation. They challenged the deprivation of birthright citizenship. Now, what's interesting about the challenge to exclusion, a case they lost, right? This is Che Champing of 1889, after the Scott Act was passed and said that Chinese traveling on passes, Chinese who left the United States before exclusion was enacted, were grandfathered in as residents. And if you left the country, you had a pass that said you could come back in. And the Scott Act in 1888 declared all those passes null and void. So this was the grounds of the exclusion case. What's interesting about the decision is that the Supreme Court ruled that immigration is a matter of federal regulation because of the interest of national security. So they use national security as a justification for a racist law. And to put a finer point on this, before the Chinese exclusion case, federal regulation of immigration was justified starting in 1875 under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, right? It saw immigration as the movement of people, just like the movement of goods. And that makes sense, right? But under the Commerce Clause, the federal government was liable for criticism for discrimination. Because after the Civil War, we have the 14th Amendment, which is supposed to protect all persons in the United States, whether or not they're citizens, protect all persons from the state infringing on their rights to due process and equal protection. So to get around the 14th Amendment, they rewrite the foundation of immigration jurisprudence to be one of national security. And this has remained in our immigration law. You can see it all the way up through Trump's Muslim ban, right? Now that to get his Muslim ban passed or by the Supreme Court, Trump had to write it 3 times because he's very sloppy, right? He thought he could just say, we don't want them. And so for national security, we're not going to let them in. And he had to rewrite it 3 times to get around this idea of discrimination. So this is still in our law. This is still the foundation of American immigration law, that immigrants come to the United States at the sufferance of the government. And the same goes for deportation. The next big case brought by Chinese was the deportation case, Fang Yuting. And it said, we're not only going to say that you have no right to enter, we're also going to say you have no right to stay under the same rationale as national security. So this has been tremendously influential because it's not just about the fate of Chinese and Chinese immigration, but all immigration into the United States is based on the Chinese exclusion cases. So our whole immigration policy, its whole history is based on justifying racism. And any reforms that we've ever had in our immigration laws is because Chinese and other immigrants fought tenaciously to reform those exclusions and restrictions.
Let me throw out a question that came from the audience. I'll embellish a little bit, but in the formal throes of the Exclusion Act, were other Asians excluded, like the Japanese, Filipinos, Koreans, Indians? Obviously, there's been discrimination in all these groups, but were they? Did the Exclusion Act apply to them?
Do you want to take that one? You can answer that one. I don't want to do all the talking.
No, that's okay. I'm perfectly happy to. But the Exclusion Act the Chinese Exclusion Act was for Chinese, and not until later on did it get applied into a Asian zone, right? And that was and that included everybody from Korea all the way down to as far west as Turkey, right? So
Afghanistan,
Afghanistan, and so that and so there was that application. Now that doesn't mean that people didn't try. For example, the gentleman agreement to exclude Japan was actually engineered before the zone was actually imposed, and that was Japan had been able to arrange that by saying there's an agreement that we will self-limit our movement to
exclude Japan from the exclusion.
Yeah.
Okay.
If they is to keep so that they wouldn't be in that situation. Mm-hmm. There's interesting cases in like Angel Island where Chinese immigration was processed or trying to be eliminated, and then there are situations where the Koreans could come in, and there are good stories about them being able to get through Angel Island because they were Korean, and so
because they were part of the Japanese Empire.
For our audience's benefit, Angel Island is off the coast of San Francisco. It is an immigration station. On the surface, looks a lot like Ellis Island, but really was designed not necessarily to facilitate Chinese or Asians from entering the U.S., but really to filter them out.
But one thing
Ellis Island was to let people in, and Angel Island was to keep people out.
Right.
And particularly Chinese people out. Mm-hmm. But I would add a little bit to what May was talking about and some of the laws that are targeted against Chinese. One of the things to look at in terms of the prohibition of Chinese coming in and so forth is actually look at the 1870 amendments to the Nationality Act. And what was going on then was the 14th Amendment had passed, and Congress was trying to regularize laws to allow it to be take out the references to prohibition against Black and African Americans and Black Americans. So there was the nationality clause, and it basically said any free white person of good character can become American citizen. So the original, what Congress tried to do to regularize that to be consistent with the 14th Amendment was to just take out the adjective white. And so the amendment actually passed, say, all free men of good character could become citizens. That amendment almost passed, right? Except that one senator from Nevada says, if you prescribe it in that way, then the Chinese can become citizens, right? So there was a huge argument. And I think that it's worthwhile to look to study and say that there was a lot of people in Congress. That's exactly what we want. We want all free people to come in. And if you take out, if you try to limit it further, then that might affect my parents who are from Europe, from Boston, Germany, things like that. So in the end, the compromise was that there's a long story about how the law was held up and so forth, and what they had to do in Congress to get it passed. But basically, that's when they introduced a compromise. Says, okay, we can't deal with the Chinese question now. Let's work on it later. But in order to get us through this Congress, let's add a section that says African Americans of good character can become citizens, and we'll deal with the Chinese question later. You see, like this. So, it's complicated in some ways to say there was a huge amount of support in Congress to do the right thing, right? And then that didn't really work out. And a lot of it was because of presidential politics. They had to balance the votes from the South and the West, and in order to get anything passed through Congress. And this one clause, an amendment to the Nationality Act, was so simple, it's just taking the word white out, held up all legislation for that whole Congress.
Yeah.
What year is that?
1870, 6970.
And I just
what Ted's raising is like super, super important because it shows the relationship between the so-called Negro question, which was under debate at the time, and the Chinese question. And at this very same time, 1869, Frederick Douglass gave a famous speech in Boston called Our Composite Nation. And he came out against Chinese exclusion. He said, let them come, let's welcome them. This country is for everybody. And yeah, maybe a lot of people will come because China is a big country, but that's okay. We want this country to be for everybody. So Frederick Douglass had a vision of America after the Civil War, which was that it should be a democratic country. And to be democratic, it had to be one of equality. And Ted is absolutely right. In the Congress, you had different interests. By the time you get to 1882 and the Exclusion Act is being debated, you had a solid South and a solid West against Chinese immigration. And in the North and in the Midwest, that's the only place where you had some opposition. And the people who opposed Chinese exclusion were the old anti-slavery congressmen. They were the old, radical Republicans and anti-slavery.
Can I comment here how Canadian laws are so different when I'm tracing them, because you've mentioned a number of acts of Congress and public debates and litigious Chinese, which is great. What I'm seeing, though, in Canada is that the federal government had orders in council, which were agreements within the Privy Council. And so no public debate was needed. It was simply a group of the Privy Council speaking amongst themselves to decide what to do and how to enact it. And at the end of that meeting, they could create an order in council, and that's it. You were done. So tracing the laws pertaining to Chinese exclusion in Canada means looking at these orders in council, one of which is PC 6229, if I'm remembering correctly. But that sort of reduces the ability of Chinese to know and understand and recognize the laws against which they're being hounded. Like there's one case which I'll bring up. In 1913, Regina versus Quan Wing in Saskatchewan. And he fought it all the way to the Supreme Court, which was rare because you needed resources to keep going like that. And he lost. But his case was he wanted to employ women, and that included white women.
Interesting. It's interesting. Just to change the direction a little bit and talk, but the idea of having resources to take a case to the Supreme Court, and May has mentioned so many cases that went forward, and I don't know, May, how much research has actually been done on how organized the Chinese groups were. I was just looking over a case, and of course we know about there's the Gonglum versus Rice case, and I've always thought that's a school desegregation case, which a young girl, Chinese girl, tried to get in a white school in Mississippi, and that, of course, wasn't allowed, and the case was brought up to the Supreme Court. But some of the books that are written about it seemed almost like that was done by a family that just persevered and did it, and had the luck of having a good lawyer at one point until they got to the Supreme Court, which is another story. But interestingly, there was a second case of a desegregation case of a young boy also in the South, who brought this case up to the Supreme Court and also lost the case. Both cases were lost because of the separate but equal type of thing. And Plessy versus Ferguson was heavily cited and so forth. And it's not until 30 years later, you have Brown versus Board of Education. But somebody financed, and what we're finding is that we're not in an urban area. We're not where the council is. We're out there in the Mississippi and Arkansas, and we're finding that the silk industry, the Chinese silk industry, financed and organized it, and it's beginning to show you that there was a lot more sophistication and organization and awareness by these so-called traditional organizations. So we could call it the silk industry, but I suspect it's probably like a merchants association or something like An Leong Association or something like
the six companies.
I was going to say, I bet they're part of An Leong. Yeah. But, all these cases are backed by the six companies, the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, An Leong, and the Qing consuls.
Yes. Well,
the Qings have a consulate in San Francisco starting in the late 1870s, and they pay for the lawyers. Between the Qing and the CCBA, they fund these cases. The CCBA, they're very savvy. They hire lawyers. They hire the best white lawyers in San Francisco. And these are lawyers who are former immigration officers who then go into private practice. So they know all the ins and outs of the laws, and they'll take a case if it's well paid. So they're very well paid. And, and when I was researching my book, I found I did some work on Huang Zhenshan, who was the Chinese consul in San Francisco in 1882 to 1884. And once the exclusion law was passed and the day it went into effect, he went down to the docks to greet the ships coming in. And he wanted to make sure the Chinese arriving were not mistreated. And when they tried to exclude Chinese, like there was a bunch of cases where they tried to exclude Chinese merchants who are exempt under the exclusion law. They tried to exclude some Chinese merchants who were actually coming from Peru to do business in California and go back to Peru. And he took it to the circuit court. There was a case of Chinese seamen who were from San Francisco. They had the papers for legal residence in California. They sailed on a ship for 6 months from California to Australia and back, and they tried to exclude them. And Huang took them to court and said, hey, the law of merchant marine is that you never leave your country if you're on the flagship, right? They were considered to never have left the United States. So he's down there at the docks every day. He's going to court whenever there's a hearing. it's really interesting. He brought complaints about violent attacks against Chinese in small towns in California. So the Qing diplomats were very active. And then later, of course, the ambassador in Washington, Liang Cheng, he is active in trying to reform the exclusion laws altogether. So this is, I'm going to end in a second, but I want to say that because China was never formally a colony of a Western power, even though it was terribly weakened, right, by unequal treaties and gunboats and et cetera, opium wars, et cetera, et cetera. But China remained an independent country. And therefore, exclusion was kind of a way to contain China because they could not control it, say, the way the British controlled India. Mm-hmm. And so they needed exclusion to keep people out, to contain China. And the fact that there were Chinese merchants who had a fair amount of wealth, as well as Qing diplomats who, in many cases, went to bat for the immigrants. This was an aspect of our communities that enabled people to resist and to fight back, which, didn't exist for, for other immigrant groups.
Someone asked, did U.S. Canadian laws to exclude Chinese encourage them to migrate to other countries in the Americas, such as Central America, where this attendee's family is from? Oh, also the Caribbean and South America.
Yes, absolutely.
Agreed.
There's on the it reminded me on Angel Island. There's all these carvings of people's poetry and things like that on the walls, and there's one that's often cited where the guy talks about it. Speaks very eloquently, but then he says, "But this place is stopping me from going to I think it was Cuba." They said like this, the Chinese term for Cuba, and so one of the explanations I heard was that the guy, the editor of the book, says, "Well, the guy was so confused he didn't know that he was coming to the United States." I don't think so. There was a lot of people that knew where they were going and what they were doing, and we had one person who gave an oral history about the boat, his boat actually winding up in Panama and something like this. So it was a storm and they wound up in Panama. Then he prospered there and grew, and then eventually came back here. The number of Chinese migrants going to these places because of the sugar plantations and so forth was actually quite startling. Actually, when they talk about coolie trade and what that term coolie meant, actually, the reference is better referred to the movement of people going to Cuba, maybe to Peru, but I'm not quite sure, but certainly to Cuba and Jamaica and these places like this. And eventually these guys thrive. In fact, the U.S. has some good studies that studied about the harm of the Chinese migrants going into these other countries. And they try to pass laws to prevent coolie trade, right? This sort of stuff like this, which was well-founded too. But
I'll go further than that. The questioner asked if it encouraged them to migrate elsewhere, and Canada actively prevented Chinese persons from landing on the eastern seaboard, where they set up a punitive system of regulations against ships who hadn't pre-approved any Chinese persons to land. And so persons would be turned away or detained. And then not even since they didn't land, they couldn't really be deported, but they were basically pushed off to other countries such as Central and South America.
But also,
I was just
going to say that there was of course, a large number of people that went to Mexico, and a lot of the Mexican Chinese populations there, or of people who probably found some form of life there to do things, but also there were people going there in preparation to coming across the border. The U.S. Border Patrol, the Mounted Border Patrol, was actually formed to address Chinese coming across the southern border into the United States. That was actually the motivation for the creation of the Mounted Border Patrol, was to address Chinese illegally entering the United States from Mexico.
The migration of Chinese to Central America and South America and the Caribbean is a really interesting history. And there are scholars and historians who've written about that. what Ted's referred to as the indentured labor migrations to the sugar plantations. It's in the middle, from the 1840s maybe through the 1870s, and they're part of a larger indentured migration from India, right, who are going to these plantations after slavery is abolished in the British Empire. They also go to Cuba, where slavery is not abolished until the 1880s. But in the 20th century, in the early 20th century, when exclusion has pretty much shut the door to Canada and the United States, you see more Chinese going who are not indentured, who are not under contracts. They're voluntary immigrants. They're either laborers or merchants who go to Central America and South America. And so I have a former PhD student who wrote a dissertation about Chinese who went to Colombia, and they often, on the one hand, go to Colombia's Pacific coast, where there's work. It's a relatively undeveloped area of the country, but they also move into the interior and they move west to the Caribbean side. And there are also Chinese who arrive in Colombia from Panama and Jamaica and Cuba, because there's a whole kind of circuit in the Caribbean of Chinese moving from island to island looking for opportunities. And what happens in a lot of these countries ultimately is they have their own Chinese exclusion laws that get passed in the 20s and 30s. And so it's always about race, I believe. And the race question in Central America and places like Brazil is, these countries are saying, or the rulers of these countries are saying, we need labor, we need immigrants. Should we have Chinese come? Or maybe we should have Europeans come. And they want to whiten their populations, right? They want to have more whites come in, meaning more Europeans. So most of these countries end up passing exclusion laws or highly restrictive immigration laws against Asian migration. And then they choose to bring over people from Italy or Spain to fill their labor needs. And then they have a whole kind of racial legislation to prevent Chinese from becoming citizens as well. So they end up doing very similar things as the United States, but there's somewhat of a different history and a different logic to it.
And were the Chinese going to some of those outlying countries? Were they under some kind of indentured contract typically, or
not by the end of China, the Qing actually outlaws the coolie trade to Cuba and Peru in late 1870s, because there are reports of how horrible it is. So mostly the Chinese, by the late 19th century and 20th century, the Chinese who are going to the Caribbean and South America and Central America are voluntary immigrants. They're either laborers, or they may be on very short-term contracts, but not indentures. But a lot of them are merchants. And what's interesting in Colombia is that a lot of them work in restaurants. And then Chinese cuisine becomes a thing in Colombia, right, in the early 20th century. And then Chinese start to move and open restaurants in small towns in the countryside. And so owning a restaurant or working in a restaurant was a kind of social mobility for Chinese. And you could go work for somebody's restaurant in the middle of nowhere, and then you could save up your money and open your own restaurant in the next town. So owners and workers sometimes went back and forth in terms of what they did. So we have something like that in the United States with Chinese restaurants, owners and workers kind of switching places. But I think it was very common in Central America, from what I understand.
But it's very interesting. Oh, I'm sorry.
You go ahead.
I think it's very interesting. It's as much a labor question as it is a racial questions. What is the interesting thing, and that you see that in the South after the Civil War, people have to the plantation owners say that they have to get another workforce if the blacks are now freed. And originally they started looking at the Chinese, thinking the Chinese would come. But one of the phenomena that we learn from that experience is the Chinese go there maybe working for, as in a way, indentured for a few years or something of this sort, or for very low wages or crop sharing. But over a period of time, the Chinese tend to accumulate capital, and then they get into the merchant areas, the commercial areas, and that's how they escape. Mm-hmm. So it's this, and so they can't hold the white owners begin to feel, well, we can't rely on this workforce because this workforce
that's right.
Build up capital and become merchants, and indeed that's what happens. They become
just to address a point that was made in one of the questions. Chinese, at least as far as I know, in Canada and the U.S., were never an enslaved people. There may have been some forms of indentured, but never enslaved.
Very little.
Yeah.
Very, very little.
Yeah.
In fact, some of the first Chinese who came over during the gold rush did come under contracts. There was a kind of indenture. There are other gold miners from other countries who brought people under contract from Chile, or even Americans from the South brought mm-hmm. slaves with them to the gold rush. And what happens is that in the gold fields, they can't hold people. Yeah. They just walk off and go find their own mining claim. Right. So it dies very, very quickly. The people who invested in contracted labor for gold mining, that goes out within, I would say by 1850, it's a dead letter.
Mm-hmm. So, actually, this whole conversation reminds me of a story about contracted labor where they made sure not to let them walk off. And it was the lesser known story of this Chinese labor corps who were contracted in China to work in World War I in the fields in Europe. Yeah. And in order to be transported, the most direct route was across the Canadian railway lines, which is a little ironic, don't you think? But tens of thousands of workers were contracted in China. They were secreted onto railway cars and just basically not allowed to leave until they were decanted in Halifax and then shipped off to dig trenches in France. And so that's how Canada both contained and participated in labor movement for Chinese workers in that era.
Right, right.
Linda, in the U.S., there's been historically a resistance to teach the history in schools about Chinese exclusion. I think you're only just starting to see that open up now. Have you seen the same in Canada, where it's been really, that history has been omitted from the history books? And
David, I wouldn't say that we've been forgotten deliberately, but we've been omitted partly because we, can I just say we don't often advocate for our own stories to be included. We don't teach or tell our own stories because we often don't know the roots and the specifics of it, which is why all of this scholarship is so important, so that we do our own stories, and then it can filter into high schools and then make it into the curricula. Now, it was the case that Chinese were excluded from public school trustee positions, or any positions, teaching included, for years, and perhaps that set a precedent for why our stories were omitted.
No one to drive the curriculum.
I see a change, 100%. Like, there are free resources for teachers who not only in Canada are trying to teach Chinese exclusion, but also Japanese internment and, shall I say, Indigenous residential school history, which was also completely omitted from our history.
Well, we have a trend now in the United States where I think 4 or 5 states have legislation mandating that Asian American history be taught in K-12 schools. And I've worked on curriculum projects for California and New York City. So this is there's a lot of activity going on. And I think, we'll see more of it. So it's interesting that in some states, we have more inclusive curriculum. That's the product of civil rights and community organizing for many years. And in other states, we have governors and state houses that want to burn books and don't want anything to be taught about race. So we live in a very divided country.
Right. Well, we just have a few more minutes left. So maybe some final thoughts, and I encourage some shameless plugs about things you're working on. Linda, we'll start with you.
Okay. with the new opening of the Chinese Canadian Museum and the Paper Trail exhibition, part of the project for the Paper Trail exhibition was the crowdsourcing of head tax certificates for genealogical research, an archive that had never before existed. That's about 400 or 500 certificates now being added to the public knowledge base. In addition, the Paper Trail managed to unlock a cache of CI 44 records. That's the ancestry collection. That only took them 2 years of arguing. And since then, my own group on Facebook, I run a group, Genealogy for Asian Canadians. And just this morning, I got notice that we have managed to get Heritage Canadiana to digitize 3 more microfilms of Chinese reentry certificates. And so my shameless plug is this. We need to find our records, we need to get them digitized, and we need to make them make sense to people so that we can find our own stories. And, I'm doing what I can to make all of that connect so that it makes sense to us. And then also relevance, when we know our own story, we know our identity, our own roots. And, to the question, where are you really from? I am from here. My family absolutely worked and strove to establish roots here. I am, from Canada.
Absolutely. May?
Well, since you invited us to give shameless plugs, please. I will plug my recent book, The Chinese Question, which came out in 2021, which is a history of Chinese exclusion policies
and also there's
community
a discussion
resistance.
with you. There's a discussion with you about the Chinese question on our YouTube channel as well.
Ah, right. Because you were so kind to invite me last year to talk about it. So that compares Chinese immigration, exclusion, and resistance in the US, Australia, and South Africa, and the British Empire more generally. And I have an older book called The Lucky Ones, which is from 2010, which some of your audience might enjoy because it's a family history of the Tape family of California, who brought one of the first civil rights cases against the exclusion of Chinese from public schools in California. But they're a very interesting family because they grew up to all be immigration brokers and interpreters. And so I think about the role of this kind of person in the middle, right? The broker who both helps the community, but also works for the government and as an in-between person, is needed by both sides, but also not trusted by either side. So those are 2 suggestions. And then I'm working on editing a book of Corky Lee's photographs, which will be published in early next year. It's a big retrospective book coming out from Penguin Random House.
In February.
And some of the photos in that book you can see now at the Chinese American Museum in DC.
Upstairs.
So, I could do all kinds of shameless plugs. But one thing I just want to do a quick comment is there has been a lot of effort trying to get Asian American studies and things legislated into schools, different school districts, and it's a spotty effort, and it's difficult sometimes to get them done, or even once they're done, it's difficult to implement them. Now, one of the things that we do in the 1882 Foundation, we do look, one of our core initiatives is to look at programs and how to, one of them is to look at teacher lesson plans and curriculum. But we take a slightly different approach than many of these legislative laws do. What these legislations ask, they're primarily, or a lot of them are based on X number of hours in ethnic studies. And so what we say is, we think that's good. Everybody should try to do that. But some of the examples of them trying to implement it have not been very successful. You get arguments about how much of that hour should be spent on this particular group or that particular group. What we like to do is we like to work with the state standards of learning. So we want to work with the people to decide how do you embed Chinese and Asian topics within the topic that is required by law. So if you're trying to teach somebody the principles of the way separation of powers of the government, then what we want to do is say, yes, teach those principles, but here are examples from the history and from the different things that we could put, and you could use that, the teachers can use that as to include into their lessons. Because teachers have so much on their plate. If they just say, if you say you have to have X number of hours for ethnic studies, then probably what's going to happen is you're going to have a lesson during Chinese New Year about food or something like that, right? So we want to look at standards of learning, and the concept there is that Chinese American and other ethnic American stories are a part of the American story, and they will illustrate those principles that we hold most dear. The other things we're doing is that, just very quickly, this year is the 80th anniversary of the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and that is through the Magnuson Act, which was passed in December 17. So what we want to do is we're going to have a sort of commemorative event at the Library of Congress, and I hope that all you guys can join us in that. It's also the 125th anniversary this year of the Supreme Court decision on Wong Kim Art, which affirmed birthright citizenship. So we want to take these two topics, and between now and then talk about the significance of these laws as a foreshadowing to the December 17 commemorative event. We want to do that in as large and noisy as a way that we can. So please join us in those events, and we go for it. Right?
Well, I think Chinese exclusion is obviously a very important part of Chinese American and Chinese Canadian history, but it doesn't really define us, and it shouldn't overshadow all of the positive contributions of Chinese Americans. I think it's just part of the story that we're telling. But to me, the story of Chinese exclusion is really important for all people, all groups in both of our respective countries to really pay attention to, because there are a lot of lessons. There's a lot of opportunities for self-reflection. There's, as Ted has worked on, there's opportunities for political apologies and statements of regret. So, I'm pleased that we don't forget to keep coming back to this topic and really showing it. So my shameless plug is we have 3 great relatively new and brand new exhibits at the museum. We have an exhibit on cheap Pao dresses and its influence on U.S. fashions and the women's movement. We have a retrospective on Corky Lee, which is a very personal tribute to the photojournalist, photographer, and friend to many of us. And then we also have this exhibit that's just terrific on Bruce Lee. 2 Lees, no relation. I want to thank Linda and May and Ted for joining us and all their great wisdom and insight. And I also want to thank Ancestry for making this event possible. So I think that's it. I think we did it.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Yes.
Thank you.
And thank you to everybody for attending. I think we had 1,217 people register for this webinar. So this event has been recorded, and depending on what's on our plate, it should be on our YouTube channel within 4 or 5 days. And we look forward to having you guys back to talk about something else.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Take
Thank
care.
you.